Welcome. I'm Warren Shield. I'm a divorce attorney in Los Angeles, California. And today we're going to be talking to Jennifer Burnham-Grubbs about life insurance. Thanks for joining us, Jennifer.
It's really my pleasure, Warren.
We've worked together for a couple of years now. I refer clients to you for life insurance, and you've also acted as experts in some of my cases. So thanks for that. Tell us a bit about your company and what you do.
Sure. I'm owner and co-founder of Quantum Insurance Services. We're a commissions agnostic insurance consulting firm based out of Los Angeles. I founded it in 2012 because after working in my industry, which was insurance, I learned that most of the advisors were working really more as salespeople as opposed to consultants, which really opened my eyes. And I thought someone's got to do something about this. So I launched a commissions agnostic insurance consulting firm.
Do you mind if I drink coffee while you're talking?
Do. I would feel sad if you didn't. And the whole purpose of our firm is to give really great advice to people, help them get the best value in their coverage, and work from a commissions agnostic perspective, which means we don't really care whether we're working harder to make less money. We see that as our job, and we want to empower people to get the best value, avoid being victims of spin in sales. And we work with a lot of trusted advisors like yourself, business managers, employment attorneys, just so that they can help get sort of really sound advice when it comes to insurance.
Now, let's start at the beginning, and I'll ask the easy questions first. Okay, so I know that there are two basic types of life insurance. I think you refer to them as buckets.
Yeah.
Term life and permanent life. What's the difference?
That's a great place to start. So term insurance is use it or lose it, I like to say. It lasts a set number of years. At the end of that number of years, your premiums are no longer guaranteed. They'll go through the roof. They don't build cash value at all. They don't have any other kind of permanent advantages for you, typically speaking. And they're meant to cover a set period of time for an amount of risk that you know is during only that time. So for example, if you have kids and you know that you're going to be vulnerable if God forbid something happens to a spouse or both parents, you want to protect that nest for 20 or 30 years until those kids can kind of be viable on their own. Term insurance is perfect for that because it's also the least expensive way to protect a family and get them, several $1 million of protection. Permanent insurance is designed to last one's entire lifetime. There are a lot of different kinds, not just whole life. Whole life is the most expensive kind of permanent insurance you can get. It's also often able to protect you for a couple different things because you can add, for example, a long-term care rider, which is a really great strategy. It can build cash value, which is something that tends to be emphasized, especially by very aggressive salespeople, which is, look at the cash value accumulation. There are a lot of benefits to cash value accumulation in life insurance policies, but what's important is you design those policies really for the benefit of the insured, not just for the benefit of the premiums being high so that the insurance person's the one making off with the best out of that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there are places for both kinds of products. The industry wouldn't be what it is if there wasn't actual value in insurance products. So the problem is it can get very confusing. And it also depends on the quality of the advisor that you're working with.
So the typical situation in the divorce is, I suppose the most common situation is where you're trying to guarantee child and spousal support. And let's say you got kids and they'll reach the age of 18 in say, 10 to 15 years. In that case, a term life policy might be appropriate of 10 to 15 years. And one of the things I've noticed is, and it cuts to the chase, is I always get a quote from you usually as to how much that will be. And I've always been surprised that it's been usually a lot less per month in premiums than I anticipated. What's the difference in price generally between a sort of term life policy and a permanent life policy?
Oh, that's such a great question. So permanent policies are always going to cost at least 3 to 5 times more than a term policy. And that's why a lot of insurance salespeople are going to try to show you permanent solutions every single time for every single need because they'll make 3 to 5 times more as well. That's why it's so important to be working with somebody who's working the way we do, which is really pretty unique in our, in how we approach it. A term policy is exactly right when you know, for example, a family is having a divorce and the ex only has to provide child support until they're grown and viable. In that case, you can save so much more money, on the cost of the insurance itself, which is great because then you're negotiating, hopefully, that you're managing to keep costs down in this area, and maybe there's more that you can put towards the actual support, for example. That's why I think efficiency and good advice in the people you're working with helps make such a big difference in creating win-win situations. I'm glad to hear that it's less than you would expect. That's the goal, is to have these products be useful and attainable so they solve problems, not create them.
Now, if you have a term life policy, can you extend it before the end of the term?
Now,
How much does that cost if you can?
That's a really great question. It really depends what carrier you're working with. So, Quantum is a brokerage firm, a brokerage consulting firm, which means we work with all the carriers that have an A rating or better, right? But often you'll meet a Mass Mutual agent or a Northwestern agent or a New York Life agent, and they're really tied to that carrier. And they know that that's a disadvantage. So they'll also say that they're able to quote any other carrier. It's not exactly true. And the quotes they show are typically designed to show, the Mass Mutual or the New York Life or the Northwestern is still being one of the best options. And unfortunately, there are also more expensive options. And depending on the carrier, conversion options really vary. So sometimes there are carriers that will be very inexpensive, but their conversion options, if the term is expiring, are just absolute garbage. And then there are other carriers where if you buy term with them, your conversion options, should you choose to convert, are as robust as their full suite of any permanent product, which is fantastic. So there's also a qualitative difference between carriers. And it's really important to be thinking ahead about, are you ever going to want to convert this thing, or is this really just going to be a term, in which case you don't need to worry about conversion being a factor.
Let's go, before I ask sort of more complex or difficult questions, I just want to go over some basic concepts with life insurance, things like the beneficiary, the legal owner, that kind of thing. Can you just give us a sort of ballpark explanation of what the most important terms are?
Yes. So I think the important thing to know is that there are three parts. There's the owner, the insured, and the beneficiary. And they can often, 2 out of the 3 can be one and the same, but they're rarely ever all 3 of them can be the same. I'll explain why. The owner of the policy is typically the person or entity paying for it, and the person who controls that policy, or the entity that controls that policy. This is important. It'll come down the road into a story I might tell you. The insured is the actual life that you're looking at, that you're guaranteeing, that you're protecting.
Right.
And then the beneficiary is the person who has been designated as the recipient of the death benefit, or the entity that's the recipient of the death benefit. And it can be multiple people. So for example, somebody could leave 50% of their life insurance policy to a beloved sister and another 50% to a charity, to say. Or often it'll be that somebody will set up a trust and designate that the trust is the entity, but it will distribute life insurance to all of the children that a person will have had by the time they've passed, right? So those are the 3 main parts.
So I want to sort of introduce the idea of the kind of case where I get involved, and there's really 2 main hypotheticals. I suppose that the first one would be where there is no policy in place and a couple are getting divorced. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that the husband is the income earner and the wife wants to get a life insurance policy on his life to guarantee her child and spousal support. And I guess what the questions are going to be, who's going to be the owner of the policy? I guess she's going to be the beneficiary. And then the question that comes up always is, who's going to pay for it? And if the husband's going to pay for it, how does she guarantee that he actually does that? How
Yes.
do you answer all those questions?
Yes. I've seen it a lot of different ways. I've seen it where there's the agreement is stipulating that this has to happen or else there's recourse. So hopefully they're incentivized to be making those payments or other things trigger. Um, I've seen what's possible to do with carriers is you can put a lump sum in and it can kind of be held in an account and distributed over time if need be.
To pay the premiums.
Yes, it
Yeah,
can be
yeah.
done that way, which is a nice convenient way so that there's less follow-up needed. Um, I have seen where you could theoretically be having a third party designated to be in charge of doing this. And I've also just sometimes put the policy in place and let somebody else figure that out and not seeing what happened on the back end, depending on what the kind of person I'm working with is. Sometimes I've just been told, hey, this guy needs 2 million, get it for him. And we do that. And then after that, the advisors are taking over and deciding. So I'm curious to see.
Well, if I'm representing the wife and I
Mm-hmm.
want to guarantee those payments, my preference would be for the wife to be the legal owner and the beneficiary. And let's say the judgment of divorce requires the husband to pay the insurance premiums.
Mm-hmm.
I just say the husband pays the premiums directly to her each month, and then she pays the insurance company.
Mm-hmm.
Is that doable? Is
Oh,
that feasible?
absolutely doable. Yeah, I think sometimes it can be calculated into the cost of support, and that
Yeah.
I think is pretty common. And I think it's a simple way to do it. So I think it's great. The only thing is getting into a position where if they're defaulting on their premiums or their insurance, if they're defaulting on their support to her and then her premiums are coming defaulted, you don't want necessarily to get into a position where the life insurance can get canceled, because
Right.
by the time they need to apply again, they may not be insurable again if something's happened with their health.
Well, if the wife were not the legal owner in that situation, all the policy notices would go to the husband, so she would never know. Now, could she be added as like an emergency contact or someone that has to be notified?
Absolutely. You're able to name and often encouraged to name a secondary designee for getting premium notices. It can be the business manager, it could be the attorney, it can be the wife, for example. I think having the wife be the owner is terrific,
The best,
as long as they'll
best
agree
option.
on it. And normally, if you've got good advisors, they can agree on that. Because at the end of the day, people just want what's going to be simple.
Yeah.
Often they're looking to really be able to cleanly part ways and not have to tangle with each other very much. So there's an incentive to keep it simple.
Well, if the husband did lapse in his premiums, could someone else pay on his behalf? Would the insurance company accept that money from someone else?
If the husband was the owner, you mean, or the wife
Yeah,
was
if the husband was the owner,
of his
didn't
own life?
pay, and the wife got a cancellation notice, could she send in a check to make sure the premiums were paid? Then she could go off to court and make sure the husband pays.
They typically don't look too closely, I'll be honest with you, as to name is on that check. So it would probably work out.
Not ideal, though. Not the
It
ideal situation.
it's certainly possible. They don't really care too much where the money is coming from, as long as it's being provided as being provided by the owner. Like, so she mailed it in and they didn't ask, they wouldn't really know.
Yeah, that seems a bit risky to me.
Yeah.
Well, what if in a situation where they can't agree on life insurance and the wife cannot get an order from the judge saying that the husband has to pay life insurance, but she wants peace of mind. So she wants to get a life insurance policy on the husband and she'll pay the premiums. Can you get insurance policy on someone else's life easily?
There is contract insurance you can get where the insured literally doesn't know and can't know, technically shouldn't even know. That would be the kind of circumstance it looks like here, where you're showing, look, I stand to lose X if something happens to Mr. Y.
Yeah.
And I want to secure my interests here. And he doesn't even know or need to know, but the point is, here I have this contract, and there's a Lloyd's of London, which is, you probably very familiar, does this. It's 1 year typically terms.
Oh, that's
So
not much.
it's not too expensive.
Oh, really?
And it's usually renewable, but so you could do something like that. You can't get policies on and insured without their signature, though. You know, you need the signature on the application. Other than that, contract.
So that would be easy. That's easy to get, I guess, if you go into court and say, look, okay, we're not, I'm not for the judge. You say, judge, we're not forcing you to pay for life insurance, but what we are asking you to do is to compel the husband to sign any life insurance agreements, and also undergo a medical. And if he doesn't do that, then please increase the amount of spousal support. If you have a court order compelling the husband to sign the agreements, then you'll be able to get the policy, presumably.
Absolutely. I think if you are able to overcome potentially what would be the objection, the thing they're going to say is, I don't want this person running around with a bounty on my head where I'm more valuable dead than alive. That's an uncomfortable situation, right? Which is, they're going to be making that argument. But you're going to say, yes, and I'm also vulnerable here, and we're making an agreement here. So I think if you could make that case to the judge favorably, you could certainly, because you're not hurting somebody by getting
it is a crime to kill someone just to
well,
get the
if you
life
kill the
insurance
person, that's
policy.
she's gonna go to jail anyway. And you made this point once on a case, was look, they would go to jail if they did something like that.
And you wouldn't get the life insurance proceeds anyway.
They figured it out. Yeah,
I've watched a lot of movies about this. I know this stuff.
Yeah,
A lot
so
of TV shows.
generally speaking, it's the Occam's razor that, look, common sense is she just wants to guarantee the spousal support. She wants to be protected, and let's find a way to work this out. Most people are able to come to an agreement that that's a reasonable circumstance, basically.
So so this sort of segues into the next, hypothetical, where there is a policy in place and they're getting divorced, and the policy is in the name of the husband, and the wife now wants to make sure that she has control of the policy. With the husband's consent or a court order, can you change the legal owner of the policy?
Yes, you can absolutely change the legal owner. Now, if it's a long story short, typically you'll see this sometimes if it's a permanent policy and you're doing that, then there's a big issue. Because you're working with irrevocable trusts and you're trying to work with a permanent solution and you're doing it for tax purposes, changing the owner triggers a look back, because they want to make sure you're not doing this in anticipation of some things that are coming down the pipeline. And so that can invalidate some of the tax advantages. But with a term insurance policy, it's usually not a big deal if you need to do that. Pretty standard, and as long as everybody's copacetic about it, there are no contingent things you need to think about. It can easily be done. Same with the beneficiary, by the way. As you know, the beneficiaries can be changed basically anytime.
And this brings us to another issue in California. California is a state where if you get divorced, it doesn't automatically change or terminate the beneficiary. So that's important. That's correct, right?
Yes, I think this is one of the most eye-opening parts of my insurance experience, was when my own husband had.
You didn't kill him. You didn't kill him for the life insurance policy.
No, so far,
what were you going to say there?
Okay, so it was a really interesting thing. My husband's parents had been divorced in the 70s or something like that. But back in the 70s, they did these permanent policies a lot of the time where they'd sell it as a nest egg for your child, and you would buy a little permanent policy that was designed to grow over time. And apparently his parents had bought one on my husband's life. Okay, he was a 1 or 2 year old kid, and there's this permanent life insurance policy on his life that was owned by
his parents. When he was 1 or 2, had bought a permanent policy on his life.
Yeah, it was common in the 70s. And it still can be done. It actually can be done as a college saving strategy, and it's great.
Oh, okay.
But this was back in the 70s, and it wasn't done in a way that they kept track of things, because what happened was later, when he was like 14 or so, they divorced. And so think about that. They were both owners, the husband and wife. They divorced. They're still technically listed as the owners because of the fact that she's his ex. But what happened is he remarried, and then his new wife became co-owner, technically speaking, and would have needed to have been updated as one of the new owners, but they never got around to it. We didn't know that, though. So for a while, this stepmother that has a terrible relationship with my husband, because Judd's father also passed away. So eventually, at some point, this new lady he never cared about, and who does not care about him at all and actually dislikes him, owned his life insurance policy.
Wow.
And was going to be the beneficiary as well. And it was not a great situation, and we could not change it because he's the insured, but he's not the owner. He has no power. Luckily, in digging and digging, we unearthed this policy and finally found out that they just never gotten around to updating it. So luckily, the owner was still listed as well as his mother, his own mother. And so she could change the whole situation, make Judd the owner of his own life insurance policy and get out of the situation he was in. And then he could just dissolve the policy and get rid of it. But it was a lesson for me. And I'll tell you why. It made me think a lot about the theoretical versus what happens in real life. Theoretically, you sign a divorce agreement. We've got the insurance on this breadwinner. Everything is fine. What happens in real life? Somebody flakes, somebody moves, somebody forgets to pay it. They didn't name a secondary beneficiary or secondary designee. Something went sideways about it, right? Or someone got policies 20 years ago, goes through a divorce settlement and says, everything's all good. I've got life insurance. We don't need to look at that. Lo and behold, they didn't know we had a case like this, I think. They'd taken loans out of that policy, and that policy is set to implode in 3 years, and it's actually not even going to exist. So there's this difference between the theoretical and what humans do, which is a little messier. I think where our job comes in is to really be able to look very carefully and closely at what is there or what is available, and try to design against that low common denominator of how something could easily go wrong, because sometimes people just make mistakes. So the goal is to find ways of making it kind of dummy proof as best as we can, or problem proof.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you bring up the question of loans, and recently we've been talking a lot about some cases with loans involved where someone took out a policy and then, 20, 25 years later, they found out that there was a huge loan on the policy. They didn't even realize that there was a loan on the policy. Do you want to talk a bit more about loans and
Yes.
how they can really mess things up for you if you're not careful?
Yes, thank you. This is one of my pet peeves. I think when permanent life insurance is sold, unfortunately, with a lot of the people in my industry, it's really touted in ways that are irresponsible. Because if you're making an investment in a permanent life insurance policy, it's really part of your retirement plan. It is not something to be messing around with. It's something extremely valuable, and you need to be really thinking cogently about it as a long-term part of your strategy. And what happens is, when it's sold irresponsibly, somebody might do something impulsively, and in a few years later change their mind about whether they were really serious about that, stop paying the premiums that were planned or whatever, and either on purpose or accidentally get into a situation where the policy is taking loans out of itself to continue the policy in force, okay? And in time, that can start to implode. And it's rare we see an example as bad as the case I think we saw recently, but we even just saw a case where it ended up, this guy's going to owe $500,000 in taxes, basically. Like, it wasn't a case I wrote, but it was a case I was asked to review. And what that really comes down to is irresponsible education from the advisor at the time this was even placed, in terms of explaining exactly what this is supposed to do and how it can benefit the person. Loans can at times be a great part of a life insurance policy, but what's most important is you have to speak with the carrier and know the fine balance between loans and premiums, so you don't put yourself into a situation where you're either owing taxes or going to kill your policy. Those are the
Yeah.
two worst pitfalls people fall
I
into.
think what I didn't understand is, let's take a permanent life policy where you're building up kind of a cash value in the policy through investments. I can understand taking let's say the policy has a cash surrender value of, $200,000. You could take loans against that. I was assuming that it would just reduce that $200,000. But what I didn't understand was where someone was not paying the premiums and the policy was paying the premiums in the form of a loan. Can you explain how that works?
You have the planned premiums in the permanent policy. Typically, there's a lot of flexibility in the premiums. They're highly calibrated. And what they're trying to do is iterate how this policy is going to be able to sustain itself for usually till age 120. But you've got death benefit, you've got cash value sometimes, and then surrender value, which is actually different. It'll be cash value minus the fees that are due, okay? And you're able to take loans against the cash value, okay? The cash value, though, is going to be credited depending on different kinds of policies based on a number of variables. If it's whole life, it'll be based on dividend performance, and those can change. They're not even necessarily guaranteed. If it's IUL, it might be based on a guaranteed minimum, but then there might be potentially good years where you're getting even more than that. If it's a guaranteed UL, then there might be just a set number. So it's a little bit harder to go sideways with something like that. But what happens is you can take money out for a little while without it catching up for you, basically. And then depending on how performance is going or something is changing, it can just start to create a cavity, basically, within the policy. And it also can be, if what you're taking out is more than what you've put in, it can start to essentially put you at fault for having gotten money out of that policy that you're not entitled to have tax-free, okay? And so I think if you get into a position where you've created that cavity in the policy, you don't want to fill the cavity back up by putting cash back in, and you want to just try to dissolve it instead, you're ending up owing for the money you sucked out of the policy.
Right, and that's I think one of the issues, when we look at, and this only applies to permanent policies, right? Not term life policies.
Oh yes, absolutely. And it's rare that this could go off the rails as badly as we saw it with this last case, but it's certainly possible.
So typically we look at, most attorneys, I think family law attorneys, look at the cash surrender value that's listed on the schedule of assets and debts. And then we do a balance sheet and say, oh, well, there's, $50,000 cash surrender value, so we'll split that in half between the spouses. But you have to know the tax impact of that. I mean, you need to know what the tax impact is surrendering, because there may be a huge tax loss because of loans taken out in the policy.
Yes, if there are loans in the policy, first of all, it's almost never good for there to be loans. Loans, if taken out of policy, should be planned loans. They can be, for example, you buy a policy when a child is born and you're going to take out loans between the college years in 18 to 20 years for 4 years, and then you're going to stop taking loans. And then when you're 65, then you'll take loans again out, but that's part of your retirement income. That's the healthy way to be doing it. Loans taken out of a policy are not meant to ever be willy-nilly or thoughtless or bad things happen. Right, they need to be planned, and they need to be strategic, and they need to be calibrated. That's the bottom line. That's the moral of the story.
Yeah, the moral of the story, yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, it's free money. You're not allowed to have free money. The government does not like that. I mean, they like a little bit, but not too much.
Well, generally. For most people. I don't want to get overtly political here, but what are life insurance trusts?
Life insurance trusts are designed to make it easier to execute the wishes of those who have done good planning,
Yeah.
basically. So you say, I bought this life insurance policy. If God forbid this person passes away, there's $2 million, okay, for my kids to inherit.
Mm-hmm.
You set up a trust. The trust controls how and when they can get that money instead of them just getting it the minute they turn 18 all at once. That's the simplest answer to it. You put an entity in charge of controlling this money, and you can tell that entity your wishes, and the entity's job is to execute it according to your wishes. That's the bottom line. It's a lot better because it gives you control. It doesn't cost a lot of money actually to set up a trust. There's a fallacy that like only really rich people have trusts, but actually almost anybody can afford to do a trust if they're, maybe making a reasonable middle class wage at least. And it just gives you much more control.
Well, I mean, I've spoken to a lot of and worked with a lot of attorneys who do estate planning. I mean, I think the ballpark, a lot of them do it for a flat rate for between $3,500 to $5,000, and then charge additional sums depending on how many assets they have to put into that trust. So, I mean, I've seen people who do it for a flat rate of $3,000. So it's a really good idea to get a trust, and that's something that you always advise a client to do when they're getting divorced, is to revisit their estate planning. I don't think I have any more questions. I think you've answered everything. Do you have any kind of tips or anything for people getting divorced?
Tips for people getting divorced: work with somebody like Warren. You need somebody really smart.
That wasn't
And
a plant, by the way.
it wasn't, but I would say divorces can get really ugly and painful. And there are a lot of people out there, like similarly in my business, there are people who are kind of sharks out for themselves, and then there are the value-driven problem solver type of people, and they're more rare. I think in your situation, there are people who are so angry in divorce that they just want to hurt the other person as much as possible, and it can end up becoming more of a battleground than a resolution ground. And I don't want to speak for you and how you approach your clients, but I think the most important thing is to remember, what are you looking to get out of this situation, and not just drive up the fees and the time it takes, because some attorneys are happy if a case takes 7 years and they're billing the whole time. And you seem like someone who's always put a lot of critical thinking in on behalf of your client, as opposed to just let's enjoy this fight and let's get it as ugly and dirty as possible.
Well, I think where I've really got some value, and you've been very helpful, is when there's an issue of support, either temporary support or permanent support, is to bring someone like you in early. And so you can get an illustration or an estimate of what it's going to cost. And I find that when you've emailed me, actually the same day, you asked me how old are the parties, how long it's going to be for, what's their health like, and this often the same day you give me a valuation or a quote, and then I send it to the other side, and that resolves the issue there and then. They go, oh, it's only going to be $150 a month. Oh yeah, we can do that. So I think it's when you leave these things, the life insurance planning, to the last moment, almost as an afterthought. I've seen a lot of attorneys, they're drafting the final divorce judgment, and then someone says, wait a minute, we should put in life insurance. That's when it becomes an issue, is you leave things to the last moment. So I got to tell you, I mean, you've been great, and I'm going to continue working with you. I love working with you. And I hope that anyone that's watching this got some benefit or value and learned something. So again, thank you very much. I'm just going to say my name is Warren Scheel. My telephone number is 310-247-9913. You can visit our website, which is www.la-familylaw.com. And Jennifer, your contact details?
Sure. I'm Jennifer Burnham Grubbs. It's Quantum Insurance Services. Our phone number is 424-286-2481. You can email us at info@teamqis.com. And our site is www.quantuminsuranceservices.com.
Thanks very much, Jennifer.
You too, Warren. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.